So this video is going to go over partitioning a device, making a file system, mounting that file system. I'm on an AWS EC2 instance and I've attached some extra storage. So if I do an ls block here, list my block devices. I've got the original device that came with it. It's 10 gigs. You can see my partitions here. And they take up the entire storage already. So I had to add a device here. I added a XVDF here. It's 20 gigs and I don't have any partitions. These devices that show up here are, hard drives, SSDs, USBs. They're storage devices. If you come from Windows, you're used to, you would plug a USB drive in and it would show up in File Explorer and you could just click on it and it was there. And the same thing will happen if you're on a desktop on a Linux machine. But if you're on a Linux machine with just a command line, you're going to have to mount it yourself. So we're going to go over partitioning, creating a file system, and then mounting that file system. So partitioning is like you take a single device, right? Like this device here, dev xvda, and you partition it into logical sections, right? Different sizes. It's like taking a hot dog, right? If you cut that one hot dog into 4 pieces, you've still got one hot dog. You've just got it's divided into 4 different pieces now. If you put them back together, you'll still have one hot dog. And when I first started partitioning, I started using fdisk, dev xvdf, and there's different tools you can use to partition disks. Some people like fdisk, some people like parted. I want to quit. Parted dev xvdf. There are different use cases for them, like maybe the size of your disk if it's over under 2 terabytes. But generally, it's one of those personal preference things. Like usually when people are like, "What text editor do you use?" You're like, "I use Nano," and they're like, "You don't use VI, you're dead to me." It's one of those situations. But yeah, so I'm gonna use the parted command here in this lesson because it's just easier for beginners, right? So initially you're gonna do ls-block. You've added a device that you want to partition. You plugged it in and it shows up here as a block device, right? XVDF. So if I do a parted and then the device and then XVDF, right? It's going to bring me into an interactive mode. You're more than welcome to do ad hoc commands. Like you can do all this in one command line go, right? Or you can go into interactive mode. I prefer to use interactive mode. So once I get here, all right, maybe I want to first I'll do a print for this device, right? So if I do a print, it's going to give me some output about this device, right? And one of the things you're going to notice is it says partition table unknown. And what we have to do is, before we can partition this device, we have to make it an MBR volume or a GPT volume or maybe even swap volume. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a make label, make label. And then it's going to ask me to choose a type. I'm going to go ahead and do GPT here. And now if I do a print again, it says partition table is GPT. And so now I can actually start partitioning this device, all right? So once I have the label defined, I'm going to go ahead and say make part or make partition. And then it's going to ask me to name the partition because it's a GPT. If you do an MBR, it will not ask you to name it. And I'm just going to name it new. It's going to ask me what kind of file system I want to ready this device to use, right? It's not going to actually format it with this file system yet, but it'll make it ready so I can format it with that file system. So I'm going to do XFS. And it's going to ask me where I want this to start, right? And generally, you're always going to do 2048S for sector. And this is you're starting to choose the size now, right? So you'll see what I mean when I make a second partition, right? And where do I want it to end? And the end is going to be, so the size of the disk is going to be the end minus the start, right? So if I want this to be 500 megabytes, right? I'm going to do 501 megabytes. And it's going to minus this 2048 sector, which is essentially 1 megabyte. So it's going to be end minus start. And then it's done. So now if I do I'm going to go ahead and quit here. And it's going to say you may need to update your Etsy F-stab. And that means if I want this to auto mount, I'm going to go ahead and update that. But we'll go over that in the mount section. So now I need to run, once I'm done partitioning that, I need to run a udev adm settle command. So the system can properly detect the new partition, right? And then I'll do an ls block. And we can see now I have this new partition. And it's not exactly 500 megabytes. My math was a little off there. But it's close. So now if I wanted to make a second partition, let's go ahead and do that so I can show you kind of how this start and end works here. So I'll go ahead and do parted again. That'll bring me into the interactive mode. It brought me in interactive mode for first disk. I want to do parted for device X VDF. We'll go ahead and make partition. We're going to name it new2. It's going to be XFS. And then we're going to want it to start. Well, it's going to have to start wherever the last partition on this device ended. So 477 megabytes. And then we said the size is the end minus the start, right? So if I want this to be maybe 200 megabytes in size, I'll have to add 200 to my start number here, so it'll be 677 megabytes. Give me a warning here. Yes. And I'm just doing this quickly, so I don't have to go through a bunch of math here. And then it's done partitioning. And then we'll do a quit to get out of the parted interactive mode. We'll do our udev adm settle here. I'll clear the screen real quick, make it clean, and I'll do a list block. And now we see I have my second partition. And it's not exactly the 200 megabytes I wanted, and that's because I didn't sit down and do the math, but you can see if you make an initial partition versus making a second partition off the same device, the start and the end is a little different. You're going to have to start at wherever the first partition ended. But now that we've got a partition, right, so we plug in a device, we partition the device, we have a partition. How do we make that a file system? Well, to do that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a make fs, so it's going to be mkfs, and then the file system type we want to use. And since we had said earlier that we wanted our partitions to use the XFS format, we're going to type .xfs here, and then we're going to choose our device here. So it's going to be dev x VDF, right? And then 1 or 2, so we'll do 1 here. And then it's gone ahead and it's made dev x VDF, the first partition here. Alright, so now that I've made my I've plugged in my device, I've made my 2 partitions, I've made them XFS file systems, right? They're not mounted yet. You can see mount points here, right? And we clearly see that, this device, 10 gigs, are mounted to the top of the root directory tree, right? But these aren't mounted to anything. So how do we go ahead and mount a file system? Well, to do that, we're going to use the mount command. And it's going to be the device, right? So xvdf, device xvdf. And when I want to mount xvdf1 partition, right? And then I'm going to have to define the file system that I want to mount it to, right? So maybe I want to mount it to new. Well, if I go ahead and enter right now, this command is not going to work. And that's because it says /new mount point does not exist. So before you want to mount a device partition or a file system, you're going to have to make sure wherever you're mounting it to exists on the machine, right? So let me go, let me back here. And let me make a new directory here, and let's call it /new. So now if I go ahead and do a mount dev xvdf1 to the new, it's going to go ahead and mount that to that directory on the system. So if we put out this block, you can see that this partition is now mounted to new. So one important thing to keep in mind though is that if you go ahead and reboot this machine, it's going to unmount and it's not going to remount automatically. So if you install a bunch of hard drives, you partition them, you make file systems, and you mount them, but you don't do these next steps, upon reboot of the machine, none of them will be mounted. You won't lose any data, they'll still be there, just nobody will be able to access them. So if you go ahead and do a list block, right, and you do a -fp for full path, it's going to spit out this long number here, and that's the UUID. And if you go ahead and you do a cat of the etc fstab, remember we had a warning about that earlier when we made a partition. It said you may have to edit etc fstab. It was referring to this file. But you can see inside here I have a UUID for the top root directory here, XFS file system, defined here. And that if you define a UUID for a partition that's been mounted in etc fstab, it will automatically mount upon reboot. So let's go ahead and let's grab this UUID for new, right? Let's go ahead and buy etc stab here, etc fstab, sorry. And let's go ahead and go to the end here. Let's go ahead and add a UUID here. And then I'm going to have to find where I want it to mount to when the system reboots. It's going to be XFS, it's going to be defaults, and it's going to be 00. So now, if I go ahead and reboot the system, which I'm not going to do, you're just going to have to believe me and try for yourself, that will be remounted.